Welcome to the Academy Podcast, a podcast dedicated to sharing rich content for the purpose of spiritual growth. I'm your host, Claire McKeever-Burgett, and I serve as the Associate Director of the Academy for Spiritual Formation, an international ministry of the Upper Room. The Academy creates transformative space for people to connect with God, self, others, and creation for the sake of the world. This month's podcast offers both audio and visual ways to listen and view it, because in June 2018, Academy Director Johnny Sears visited with his friend and mentor Parker Palmer at the Palmer home in Madison, Wisconsin, and we were lucky enough to get to film it. Witnessing their conversation live and now sharing it with you a few months later is one of the great gifts of my life. Parker and Johnny talked about everything from vulnerability to what makes a good leader, to how to sustain the work of the Academy for the next 35 years. What follows is an offering from their conversation on spiritual friendship and shared vocation, in hopes that their mutual dialogue about life, love, work, passion, leadership, and spirituality might enrich your own lives and the conversations that comprise them. Parker Palmer is the founder and senior partner emeritus of the Center for Courage and Renewal, and a world-renowned writer, speaker, and activist who focuses on issues in education, community, leadership, spirituality, and social change. He has reached millions worldwide through his 9 books, including Let Your Life Speak, The Courage to Teach, A Hidden Wholeness, and Healing the Heart of Democracy. The episode picks up with Johnny asking Parker about his friendship and connection with John McGabgab, founding member of the Academy and editor of Weavings, a journal for the Christian spiritual life, and Henry Nouwen. The friendship between Parker, Henry, and John served as a catalyst, an inspiration, and a motivation for the beginnings of the Academy 35 years ago. Listen and watch on, beloveds, and enjoy.
I'd be curious if you would share some more about those stories of you and John and Henry together at Pendle Hill.
Mm-hmm. Well, those are good memories.
Yeah.
Those are wonderful memories. And it turns out that Pendle Hill was a nexus for me of a number of connections that ended up converging in the Academy for Spiritual Formation, because one of the founders of Pendle Hill was Douglas Steer. This Pendle Hill being a Quaker living learning community adult study center near Philadelphia. It was founded by some weighty friends, as they like to call them in the Quaker community, Rufus Jones and Douglas Steer being among, Thomas Kelly being among those people. And Douglas was, when I became Dean of Studies at Pendle Hill, he was still very active on the board and a conversation partner, he and his wife Dorothy, with me. I was mentored by them in many ways. So there's that connection. I met Henry Nouwen somewhere in the mid to late 70s when I was Dean of Studies at Pendle Hill. And we met because the Lilly Endowment had started giving grants in spirituality. And as sometimes happens at a foundation, they start giving grants and then or start receiving proposals and then realize that they don't really know what they're talking about. It just happens that way.
Yeah.
It's a human thing. And so they had the aspiration, but they needed some help discerning among these proposals, which are the ones we ought to fund and which ought we not. And so they invited, I think it was 8 or 10 people, to cloister themselves in a hotel in New York City for about 3 or 4 days and read hundreds of applications.
Wow.
And I was one of those people, and Henry was one of those people. And so it was in that kind of intense experience of, talking about the content of the applications and the aims of the program and how a program like that, spiritually oriented program, might fit in the society of the day. It was in that context that Henry and I became friends and ongoing conversation partners. So the next thing I knew, Henry was offering, as he always did so generously, to write the foreword for my first book, The Promise of Paradox, which was published by little Ave Maria Press at Notre Dame. So it was going to have I was going to thank you. It was going to have a largely Catholic audience, and at first anyway. And Henry, just this generous guy, said, I'd love to write the foreword to that. And he wrote this beautiful, beautiful foreword to The Promise of Paradox, which sort of, which he was an established writer by then. He wasn't all that much older than I, but it really helped put that book on the map because he was well known already, I think, for Reaching Out, or I can't quite remember, one of those books. And then, at that time, he was teaching at Yale. And he said, I have an idea, which, as I think back on it, was really an audacious, big idea. He said, why don't I come down to Pendle Hill every other week for a full day, and you and I sit and talk about our shared interests in spirituality, education, and community. And then I'll do that every other week for an academic year. We ended up doing it for 2 academic years. And he said, between our meetings, we will each write memos to each other. And in those days, you stuck it in an envelope and stuck it in the mail. Yeah. You didn't pop it in an email. And then our next conversation will spring off that memo, which was a brilliant way to proceed. And the next thing I knew, I think it was on our second of those meetings, he said, I'd like to bring my assistant along, my teaching assistant and the fellow who helps me with my writing, John Mogabgab. I said, great. And I quickly became friends with John. I mean, he was one of the most winsome people on the face of the earth, and so profoundly spiritually grounded and so bright. And I was just learning like crazy from John. Yeah. And he became part of that conversation over a 2-year period. And it influenced both Henry's writing and my writing. And so after a bit, I wrote The Company of Strangers, and then I wrote To Know As We Are Known. And both of those books were really heavily influenced by that. And then along the way, I also spent time at the Institute for Ecumenical and Cultural Research, where Marjorie and John were getting to know each other, and I was getting to know Marjorie. And of course, I love her very, very much too, and have worked with her in various ways over the years. So yeah, lots of connections. And the last one I'll mention is someone I never met, but have always felt like he knew me and I knew him, and that's Thomas Mertons, with whom I have this kind of like spiritual connection or something. I don't even know how to name it, but a kind of friendship with someone you never met, who you feel like I feel like when I read him, he somehow knew me before I knew myself, and his writing helped me know myself better and was grounding and reassuring in all kinds of ways. And then along comes Weavings, and I started writing for them. Right. I've always been grateful to Weavings for helping me become a better writer and to start putting some of my stuff out in the public sphere. So that's part of the story.
Yeah, I love all of those relationships. Merton is something, the way you describe that relationship with Merton is something I share. It's one of the things I think that quickly resonated with me when I first began encountering your work, is that same love of Merton. And it felt that my relationship with Merton began through Glenn Henson. I was taking classes at the Baptist Seminary of Kentucky, exploring a sense of occult ministry that, took an interesting path. But
because you had been in a different career.
I started off as an engineer professionally. So I have a master's degree in engineering and was working for Lexmark International and designing laser printers.
So this was a natural career move for you.
Clearly. Very obvious trajectory, yeah. And along that way, I actually found out about spiritual direction as, and growing up Baptist, never knew what that was. When I discovered that, it was such a gift and such a lifeline, because it was a place where I could be held and listened to and ask the questions without anybody expecting me to resolve them quickly.
Right.
And
what a gift.
That was, this is in my sort of late 20s. And so I end up deciding to take classes at this new seminary as a way of exploring a sense of call to ministry. And the first class I take is a class called Ministers as Spiritual Guides, and Glenn Henson is the teacher. So Glenn knew Merton personally, and he took a group of us to Gethsemane, so I got to be at the Abbey of Gethsemane and began reading this work, and it was just, it just opened so many things for me. But Merton, I particularly felt a deep resonance with. It was like, there was this connection to the soul. Here was someone who wrote so deeply and honestly about his own struggles, about the struggles of the world, and would just hold those tensions.
Right.
Merton seemed to me, I think Merton hated easy answers.
Absolutely. He said, I am traveling toward my destiny in the belly of a paradox, which means in the belly of unanswerable questions.
Right. And there was something about that was just freeing for me. And so Merton has kind of always been one of my spiritual guides, even though I came along many years after he had already passed away.
I was reading him once, and he writes about a Muslim mystic of the Middle Ages. I can't quite remember the century, 14th maybe. His name was Al-Hallaj, and people who know the mystical side of Muslim spirituality know Al-Hallaj very well. And Merton, who obviously never knew Al-Hallaj, said, my relationship to him could be called a friendship, a love, a rescue. And I did an essay recently for a volume on Merton called A Friendship, a Love, a Rescue, because that's how he served for me, and obviously for lots and lots and lots of people. And the other piece of Merton, which I'm sure we'll return to this theme at some point in our conversation, Johnny. The other piece of Merton is that here's this guy tucked away in the wooded hills of Kentucky, seeming to most people to have escaped from the rigors of the world. And yet he writes so compellingly about race and about war and about the great social issues of our time after he gets through his period of rather thin piosity, which embarrassed him later in life. He said, there's a bunch of books I wish I hadn't written because they now embarrass me.
Have you seen the little graph that he makes of all of his books?
Yeah.
And grades them?
Yeah, number one, The Way of Chuang Tzu. Taoist tales that he helped translate, but he learned so much from the East that illumined his own tradition. But he's still, despite the fact that he's a monastic tucked away, he's regarded by people in the peace movement and in the racial justice movement as a leader, as a patron saint. And so he modeled for a lot of us what it means to have an inner life that isn't narcissistic, that doesn't disappear into into the ego and into just kind of feathering your own nest. But it actually loops around and comes back out into the world, which is a big question in the spiritual life. I like, when I talk with folks about this, I always say my favorite book title in recent years is a collection of poems by Tony Hoagland called What Narcissism Means to Me. And yeah, I think that it's a great jibe, in terms of a society where a lot of people are turning inward and never coming back out.
Yeah.
And if you can't get out of the rabbit hole, it ain't spirituality.
Right.
It's escape. It's something pathological, really, in terms of withdrawing from the world. But Merton modeled a way of having a spiritual life that actually loops back out. I call it life on the Mobius strip, to engagement with the world.
Right. The way I've phrased it is the contemplative life always springs from community. May lead into solitude, but the genuine contemplative life leads back to community,
always
into a deeper engagement with the world.
Always.
It is not escapism.
Yeah, no, not one of those paradoxes, that Merton was so fond of. I don't know that he names this specifically, but I always phrase it in terms: were we born for community? Absolutely yes. We couldn't exist or survive without it. Were we born for solitude? Absolutely yes, because ultimately life becomes a journey that we can only take alone. And so there's no contradiction there.
Right.
It's both and.
What I love about it is there's just something beautiful about the way the Holy Spirit, that's the way I would phrase it, the Holy Spirit works through relationships.
Right.
You didn't set out when you came together and started having those conversations to create anything particularly.
No.
It was about the spiritual friendship.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. As you know, Johnny, I've always felt that when you meet someone that you recognize as a friend, you've also met someone with whom you have a shared vocation in the most generic sense of that term. And I think that it may not be it may not manifest itself. It probably won't manifest itself in the same way, but the vocation will be there. That's sort of the reason you're friends.
Yeah.
You recognize that this person is somehow on earth for more or less the same reason that I am, and you start getting clues about yourself as well as clues about them and about the shared work that you're being called to do. And I definitely, as you know, believe in callings. I mean, I think you don't. I think vocation is a gift to be received rather than a goal to be achieved, to use one of Henry's tropes. And so when John and Henry and I were meeting in the late 70s, and of course we were meeting in a social context where Vietnam was cranking up and race was very much on the table, and the women's movement was starting to build, and there was a very complicated thing going on in the spiritual life of this country here. But in the midst of that, here are three spiritual friends. What does it mean to be a spiritual friend? Well, I think it means a lot more than if you have a problem, you can come to me, and I'll give you deep listening and honest, open questions, and we may meditate together, we may pray together, we may work on various modalities of discernment. But I think at a very deep level, to have a spiritual friend is to have encouragement to pursue what's often a countercultural path. I don't know any founding stories of the world's great religions that aren't profoundly countercultural.
Right.
If they aren't countercultural, they're political or conventional.
Right.
And nobody remembers those stories. They're just boring. and they just perpetuate the status quo. But Jesus was quite a countercultural person.
The political stories are about winning or losing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And
so somebody's always losing, and so somebody's always disappointed, and it just buries the issues, which are going to come back later.
Yeah, and the spiritual stories are, if you seek your life, you'll lose it, and if you're willing to lose your life for the sake of something greater, you'll find it. And that's not how politics works, for the most part. So Henry and I think the Academy for Spiritual Formation grew out of that sort of rich seedbed of spiritual friendship, and this overlap between friendship and vocation.
Yeah.
In a complex way. I was not part of the formation of the Academy for Spiritual Formation.
Not directly, right.
But I was pursuing a similar vocation or ministry along a different path. As it turned out, my ministry was largely to the secular world. It began in secular higher education. And my task was to find ways to translate the spiritual concerns I had about the condition of education and the condition in which it was leaving students, to translate that into terms that would be acceptable at a Class A research university, right?
Right.
Where there's not even a chapel because everybody would go up and smoke about church-state issues,
right.
You know. And so that was a very different mission than the one perceived by the founders of the Academy, but it was the same vocation.
Right.
It was ministry under a different flag, and so that was a seedbed time. But I think it's really important to understand that spiritual friendship, which is, I know, part of what you guys prepare people for, and what I've always needed from others and wanted to offer others, is really about that soul-deep encouragement to walk a path for which the world doesn't offer much encouragement. In fact, the world says, that's crazy. You know, that's not a good career move, right? And you have to say, well, I'm not in search of a career. I'm in search of a vocation. And I'm pursuing clues that I know, I understand nobody else can see them or hear them. My family can't, you know, my parents can't, my friends can't. I mean, I got all those questions like, what in heaven's name are you doing with your life, Parker? You have a PhD from Berkeley. Why did you walk away from academia, become a community organizer, and for 5 years in Washington, D.C., and then, you know, join this hippie commune at Pendle Hill where you're eating granola and garbanzo beans all the time? And, you know, to quote our good friend, Sister Elaine Prevolet of the Sisters of Loretto, who is also part of this picture for me because she was at Pendle Hill. I invited her as dean to come as a teacher for several years. She was a wonderful, magnificent teacher. But she always said, well, vocation is about, I can't not do it. Yeah. I can't give you a good rational reason why.
Yeah.
Like this is going to lead to a big salary or to high status or leverage and impact, but I can't not do it. And when I talk with young people today about vocation, I'd say, is there anything you can't not do? Because if you can name that, then you've got a powerful clue to your vocation. Yeah. And I think that's part of what spiritual formation is all about.
In reading a recent meditation on finding God in the company of our life's best friends, Stephen Batchelor writes of these spiritual friends that their task is not to make themselves indispensable, but redundant. Their task is not to make themselves indispensable, but redundant. I've been meditating on this wisdom for days now, and it's mingled so beautifully with the wisdom Parker and Johnny share throughout their conversation that I'm beginning to sense that along with finding the thing I can't not do in terms of my vocation, I am also charged with finding the people I can't not hear. That is not to say I need to listen only to those who speak the loudest. Rather, it is to ask of myself whose wisdom plays in my mind, body, and spirit over and over and over again. Who in my life is redundant with their love? Perhaps just as it is with vocation, it also is with spiritual friends. These people and this calling are those I can't ignore even when I try. An ever-present invitation to a repetitive song, a familiar dance, a recitable poem. Finding in the familiarity and the redundancy a magical spark that makes it anything but boring. This is the life I long to live. These are the people I long to know. May it ever be so. To hear more from faculty and wisdom guides like Parker Palmer, join us at the next 5-day or 2-year academy. And to learn more from Parker and Johnny's conversation, tune in next month, November 13th to be exact, for another audio-visual episode from their time together. For all of this and more, visit academy.upperroom.org.